introduce Professor Raul Trejo Villalobos. He is a professor of philosophy at the Autonomous University of Chiapas. He is also a member of the National System of Researchers of Mexico, as well as a founder and first coordinator of the degree in philosophy at the University of Chiapas. He specializes in Mexican philosophy and indigenous philosophy, and his talk today will give us some insight into his intellectual background, but as well as the practice of doing intercultural philosophy. Professor Raul Trejo Villalobos, you have the stage. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thanks to Federica, Fernando, and Adrian for the invitation. And I want to thanks all of you for listening to me. And secondly, I want to apologize about my mistakes in communications because I am a little nervous and my English is not good. So I will to share my talk, and I will to read it, not completely, but this is that I want to share with you. Okay, interculturality, experience, and reflections. Introduction. Over the last decades, the philosophical thought has increasingly worked on such topics as interculturality and multiculturality. As a matter of fact, in the case of Mexico, specialized literature began to be abundant. Thus, for example, Luis Villoro, León Olivé, Mauricio Beuchot, Mario Teodoro Ramírez, Ambrosio Velasco, and Raúl Alcalá. We can particularly highlight two articles, Mario Teodoro Ramírez, Frónesis Intercultural and Interculturalidad y Sentido Común, Incidencias para el Alcance de la Solidaridad y la Justicia, from Dora Elvira García. Relying on his study of Luis Villoro, Ramírez suggests 4 criteria for a practical intercultural reason: concreteness or contextualization, openness or indetermination, hypothetical universality, and partially or literal encounters. On her article, Dora Elvira remarks, to think about common sense as a pivotal category for the relationship among cultures enables the defense of such interculturality from an hermeneutics category to achieve available human life meant to be in the plural. This is possible in multicultural interrelations due to the achievement of common goals, which are meant to overcome particularities. This takes for granted the presence of an element that allows us to see those goals through the reach of common agreements. Such an element lies in the category of common sense. We have to outline, before we continue, that both authors take into account, to a lesser or greater extent, the ideas of Luis Villoro and Raúl Fornet Betancourt, taking for granted that we can come back to them on a later studies. This time, we would like to go to the sources themselves. For this reason, the aim of this work is to share with you a number, just an experience, and thoughts about something that we could provisionally call interculturality. In order to do so, we will divide our exposition in 4 points. First of all, we bring into account the problem related to the definition of interculturality, as settled by Raúl Fornet Betancourt. Secondly, some ideas related to the general condition of interculturality are to be exposed as developed by Luis Villoro in his book, Los retos de la sociedad por venir. In third place, we addresses the text Interculturalidad o Barbarie, 11 tesis para el mejoramiento de las teorías y prácticas de la interculturalidad como alternativa de otra humanidad, by Fornet Betancourt. Last but not least, we are sharing some experience from la Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas. Number 1, problems concerning the definition of interculturality. According to Raul Fornet Betancourt, there are 4 problems concerning the definition of interculturality. The first one resides in the fact that question and definition are inherent to both the logic of Western scientific culture and the art of knowing how to define and classify. The second problem derived from the first ones and places the definition in it itself delimits, fragments, divides, fixes. By proceeding this way, the author tells us some aspect or elements of interculturality itself might get lost or even be sacrificed. In third place, in related with the second one, whenever we try to define, we don't only objectify what which is defined, but there is also a detachment between the subject and the object. Thus, taking the risk to conceive the field of interculturality as an objective world that is examined from a distance. In other words, blocking the possibility to see ourselves as active subjects in the process of interculturality. The fourth and the last problem tells us that definition don't come from vacuum, but in the framework of a discipline, theory, or system prior to them. In short, if by asking about interculturality, we set ourselves in one culture that defines, fragments, objectifies, and is detached from its object, then there is not much sense in doing it in such monocultural way. This is why Fornet Betancourt makes a restatement of the problem through many points. First of all, we have to recognize our intercultural illiteracy so we can start a new learning, thinking, or literacy process. Among those processes, and more important than defining, we are seeking to name in an informal way or to think definition as just supporting point which we would use to contrast with the experiential and biographical level. I think this is a very important point. A second point, conditions of interculturality. According to Luis Villoro, any thoughts about interculturality must begin with the fact, the plurality of cultures, simultaneous and successive in history. Every one of these cultures corresponds to a way of living. Each and every one fulfills many functions. They express emotions, desires, and ways of feeling. They point out values, allow preference, and the choosing of goals. They give sense to attitude and behaviors. Thus, every culture offers unity to the group as a collective whole. One of the first conditions for a theory of interculturality lies in identifying and comprehending a culture. Identifying a culture consists in getting to know if it fulfills those functions. To comprehend a culture means not to judge it and refrain from any evaluation. Following Villoro, every culture has two dimensions from which they can be comprehended. That one of power and the one of values. We think that this first condition suggested by Villoro can be taken into account with the methodology proposed by Fornet Betancourt. Another condition to interculturality after comprehension lies in the assessment, to judge in which ways it accomplishes or not the function mentioned before. From this point of view, cultures will be superior to one another just in specific aspects. Some of them will be more or less effective than others. Facing the question of whether or not all cultures are equivalent, Villoro points out that the equivalence among many instances can occur because they are thought as having the same value or because they are seen as variations of only one. In the first case, we will talk of equivalence, and in the second one, of a culture that pretends to be universal. After raising some idea related to the relativism and universalism problem, Villoro holds that if there is not only one only culture that can be used as a pattern to judge the others, and taking into account that there is no culture that can call himself universal, we can then face the so-called Western universalism with the opening of an alternative to comprehend singular cultures, setting analogies and partial similarities among them. After identifying and comprehending one culture, and after comparing and value cultures, Villoro suggests as a third condition to interculturality and its comprehension, the setting of some criteria: autonomy, authenticity, and purpose. It is important to outline that such criteria do not state values from a particular culture, but only some points of view. At the same time, they want to be universal, meaning that they wish to accomplish some sense of formality. And at the same time, those criteria could be used by an intercultural ethics. By autonomy, Villoro understands the capability of self-determination with no coercion or external violence. This includes at the same time acknowledging this word, the others and our difference, by means of tolerance through which not only coexistence is accepted, but the also fortune or destiny of other cultures. Regarding authenticity, Villoro says we could name a culture authentic when, one, their external manifestations are consistent with the desires, attitudes, and purpose of their members, and two, due to the fact that these dispositions are conditioned by needs. And other features of authenticity will be one cultures according with the needs of the community which produce them. As for the criteria of purpose, Villoro considers that every culture not only accomplishes that when it points out goals and values, but also when it gets sure that those goals and values are reachable, or even more when those ones aim at superior ways of living. Concluding, Villoro holds that interculturalism begins with the fact of the multiplicity and diversity of cultures. In the same way, he says that each culture is unique, not replaceable by any other. On the other hand, he says interculturality doesn't allow to assess a culture just by the patterns of another one. And finally, that a theory of the criteria from which plurality of cultures can be valued would be the subject of interculturality. 3. Thesis about interculturality. Fournet Betancourt thesis about interculturality are a group of reflection about the theoretical and practical condition of it, with the aim to improve the possibilities of completion and the final purpose of interculturality itself. As long as reflection, such theses are to be thought as provisional and proactive opinions, but above all, as clues to face the challenge of interculturality in Latin America and more specifically on the education field. The first 4 theses talk about correcting the habit of the absolute reason and irrefutable evidence, apodictic speech, and eternal truths. 2. Criticisms to the philosophical liturgy of conceptual abstractionism, counterbalancing in with local wisdom and contextualized knowledge. 3. The recovering of situational context in which we have to talk more of concrete men and women from the perspective of their living corporality up to the experience of fragility. And 4, the criticisms of reason and law, or saying in a different way, to the reason that thinks itself as legislative power. The following 3 theses take into account the overcoming of Western philosophical criticisms through the alternative proposition of an open process of consultation and communication as the ways in which humanity situationally articulates that which are their worries or desires, that which knows or wants to know, that which must or must do not do. 6, the articulation of intercultural dialogue from concrete cultural practices. And 7, the contextualized criticisms to dominant cultures. Now, next theses are to put in some way more specific and talk about 8, the criticism to institutions which regulate scientific and cultural, political, and social, economical, and commercial exchange. 9, the criticisms to neoliberal globalization and its dynamic, which is mildness and uniforms. 10, the radical reform of current university and the criticisms to the current institution of higher education, and concretely, the current system of university specialization. In the last thesis, the 11th one, the author recapitulates the previous ones and simultaneously takes into account that interculturality or barbarity are the words that we might possibly pass on future generations, considering thus that commitment to action is required. Point 4, practices of interculturality, original or native peoples and university education. Preliminaries. The territory of what currently is the Mexican province of Chiapas has been inhabited at least a millennia and a half before the Christian era. During the next millennia, important certains of Mayan civilizations appeared, such as Bonampak, Yaxchilan, Tonina, Palenque, among others. On the centuries to come, according to Ruth Lulliers, such civilization collapsed and they survived like this, decimated by difficult life conditions until Spanish conquest, with a self-sufficient economy, a communitarian system, and a very low cultural level. According to Jan de Vos, during the Aztec Empire expansion, a tiny part of territory was barely conquered. In contrast with the Spaniards, the centuries to come, a total and definitive occupation was consolidated. Even though the testimony of indigenous people itself about the conquest is missing, Jan de Vos says, we can imagine that the greater impact was registered in the 3 vital levels that constitute the life of any human being: the relationship with nature, the way of living with others, and the experience of divine. The author thinks about 3 moments: the initial trauma, that of the yoke of colonialism itself, and the mestizo aggressions corresponding to the independent era. Nonetheless, during all these centuries, a varied span of resistance has appeared: the open-ended, the hidden, and the negotiated one. In accordance with Mexican government, there are currently 12 indigenous languages in Chiapas: Celtal, Tzotzil, Chol, Tojolabal, Mam, Canjobal, Chug, Lacandon, Jacalteco, Catoc, Teco, and Soque. From these, only the last one does not belong to Mayan origin, and the first 2 are the ones that have the greater number of speakers. No matter how many political, economic, and social change have taken place in the last decades, Chiapas is still defined by having high rates of poverty and illiteracy. It is these high rates that indigenous communities live. As to higher And university education, we have to say that these ones had their beginning in the 60s from last century with the following school and disciplines: business management, engineering, and the Language Institute, located in Tuxtla Gutierrez. Law School in San Cristobal de las Casas. 10 years later, with the opening of medicine school and the ones already mentioned, La Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas was finally created. During these years and the following to come, new social science and humanity programs were created: sociology, anthropology, history, pedagogy, librarianship, communication studies, and Spanish language and literature. Besides another programs, institutions, and graduated studies, it only remains to say that the Universidad Intercultural de Chiapas was founded in 2004. And the bachelor's degrees of philosophy, along with the master degree on cultural history, which both belong to the Facultad de Humanidades de la Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, were founded in 2011. It is here where we can emphasize the work of Luis Madrigal Frias, because he has been an encouraged person, a promoter and a scholar of philosophy in general, and Mayan philosophical thought in particular. It is also important to highlight that the bachelor degree on philosophy takes into account, besides the Western canon, an important number of subjects related to Iberoamericans, Mexican, and original peoples philosophy. Due to this fact, the university has received exchange students from other universities and countries. Problems. Now, in accordance with the ideas and reflections that were suggested in previous section about interculturality, it is necessary to clarify and recognize that relationship among the members of original peoples and us who don't belong to them has not been free from difficulties and problems. In other words, the relationship among these different cultures don't follow the patterns of interculturality that we have been talking about. When we want to say is that more members of original peoples have entered higher education and university since armed uprising of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional in 1994. In doing so, they have had to learn a second language and most of the time leave their communities behind. This last thing that we just said, simple as it might be, contains many problems. One, when they do have the opportunity to go to elementary school, they face the fact that teachers don't speak their language. Two, whenever they have the opportunity to leave their communities to continue with their education, apart from learning a foreign language, they have to make a series of changes concerning the way they understand things, their relation with others, and the world. And three, in the scholar field, and with the exception provided, there is no achievement because the evaluation criteria keeps of being the one established by the dominant system and culture. Being aware that more aspects of this problem can be found, we consider that they can be research material or later interculturality investigation. And this due to the fact that they belong to the topics of self-determination and identify the original peoples, as Villoro points out. Experience. To finish our exposition, we would like to bring up some cases of people who have left their communities behind, who have studied a discipline, but that nonetheless have decided to keep their cultures, ideas, and practice, and who have also decided to dialogue. We bring back the result of an intercultural experience, one that took place in March 2019. In this experience, they share some of their talks. For example, Raul Pesa Salazar from Zapotec community talked to us about Gendevianí. He says, Gendevianí is integrated by two words, genda and biani. Genda means being or essence. It is used as some concept prefix in order to join beings with common properties under an ontological or an abstract category. Biani or light refers concretely to light and holds a certain degree of connection with light from height above. Therefore, Gendeviani talks about all lights being or the whole of lights. Its being consists on gathering all lights in itself. Francisco Santis from Celtal Communities, talking about his reading on Luis Villoro books, Los Grandes Momentos del Indigenismo en México, tell us, well now, let's think from the Celtalectic. Why do the concept use hide a concrete reality? How does language mask the reality? Mextatic, papas and mamas, mothers and fathers, answers and simple, because there wasn't kopayek. Kopayek, which means to talk listening. There wasn't icheltamuk, meaning to bring one's greatness before us. There was only to kel tabatik, one-sidedness in the production of knowledge. Tui bajel, superiority when talking about us with the voice from us, hootik. Manuel Bolom from Tzotzil Communities talks about some life ideas related to the process of corn growth. He says, when sowing time has come, they begin to choose the mazorcas that will be used as seed this year. They observe them and know which one will be useful to continue life. Kukshul or Yol. Kukshul tells the seed is alive, has light, it has hope. Oyol tells that it is suitable to germinate, which is to say that it has a child. In last place, Roberto Perez, also from Tzotzil Communities, reflects on idea concerning the soul and some of its moral consequence. Chulel as a moral conscientiousness is an ethic based on collaboration, service, and gratefulness from which Mayan system of values is built. Chulel, moral conscientiousness is only possible as far as Mayan people could comprehend and understand the reality. The immediate meditation of Chulei in the behavior of Batsivinik ants. It is achievable by means of Icheltamuk to bring dignity to all beings, and the Icheltakush, the act of valuing all beings. And this so because to Mayam's view, there are no objects in the context, but only subjects. Interculturality. Before the desire, an attitude of wanting to define everything, we decide now to refrain ourselves from it. We're not going to define what interculturality is. This doesn't mean, of course, that we will quit totally and uncritically on everything that comes from Western culture, but that we will begin to look at it in a different way, with a different perspective. This doesn't mean, obviously, a renounce to reason and the rational abilities, but to begin to see that this reason is barely a part of a complex whole, along with emotions and experience. Now, even when we refrain from presenting an interculturality definition, we cannot refrain from one, recognizing that there is not a culture that serves as a pattern to others, that there is no such a thing as the universal culture, but a culture that has pretended to be universal. Two, what rather exists is a diversity of cultures. And three, the fact that before getting into definitions, we could raise some criteria for a possible interculturality. So before getting into the raising of criteria for a possible interculturality, we consider that a change of one's attitude, understood as autognosis and self-criticisms, as well as change of attitudes toward the others, it is necessary. Autognosis and self-criticisms in this field, it might mean to silence the noise that each and every one of us has, and it might also mean to develop a listening ability. Genda is being or essence. Copayer is talk listening. Loilayer is dialogue, listening and sense. Chulel is knowledge, soul, and moral conscientiousness. No matter the difference among the mentioned authors in previous page, there are two coincidences when talking about interculturality. On one side, resistance and criticism to a culture that proclaims itself as the model for others, that considers itself universal and so homogenized and dominates. And the other side, that another way to make philosophy is possible. Furthermore, that another humanity in the diversity of its cultures and worldviews is possible, and more than possible, necessary. Well, this is the talk, but I want to share finally this picture. Well, this is what I talk about, the points. Raúl Fornet Betancourt, Luis Villoro, one more time, Raúl Fornet Betancourt, and well, it is important to say Chiapas is in the south of Mexico, but it is most important that the Mayan area, it is bigger than states, includes another states and Guatemala. Here is Comandanta Ramona del Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. The experience we have with the members of the original peoples, it was in 2019. This is Raúl Pesa when he talked about Gendeviani. This is Francisco Santis, Celtalectic, and this is the book, the little book we published with this experience. This is Manuel Bolón Pale, who talks about the corn. And this is Roberto Perez, who talks about Chulel. In the panoramical picture. And that's it. Thank you.